can go back. Logan Motashani's got some really good data on housing supply, and the total housing supply, counting both sales of existing homes and new homes under development, had been in retreat for 10 or 12 years.
Yep.
And that trend hasn't even, it hasn't accelerated to the downside. We just continue to sort of we're basically just manifesting or extending the exact same trend that's been in place since sort of 2015, 2016. The private sector has just not demonstrated a willingness or capacity to build homes to satisfy demand for at least the last 7 or 8 years, even in the most favorable interest rate environment that anyone could ever wish for in terms of funding new developments. So I'm not sure that we can point to a slowdown in home building or higher interest rates motivating home builders to shut in some development projects as being the causal factor in the lack of home supply. I mean, I think there's just a general failure of the private sector to deliver a sufficient number of homes to individuals, especially in places where people want to form new families. So near urban centers that have the prospect of work that people want to pursue, right? So I find it hard to we haven't even seen a material rollover, and we've certainly seen a rollover in turnover of homes. We've seen a slowdown in home building, but as far as I can see, home prices are still.
What we've seen so far is a slowdown in housing starts, but houses under construction are still at their peak because of the relatively slow process of building a home and the delays associated with supply chain disruptions that meant that toilets from Japan didn't make it to the United States, for example, right? But that's
okay. But if we see that with lumber prices, then I mean, clearly there was a supply problem like a year and a half ago. But there's, the basic building blocks for building new homes. I think it's hard to argue that there were major supply chain disruptions for the last 18 months or so, right?
18 months I would push back on. Last 6 months I would definitely agree with you. 18 months ago, like it's easy to forget how long ago 18 months is, right? So, we're October or November, I guess, actually, 18 months ago, basically it's February of 2021. You were very much in the thick of housing going absolutely bananas. And I believe that at that point we had, near the highest number, because I remember writing about this at the time, we had near the highest number of homes under construction in basically the past 20 years. We actually were beginning to pass the levels of 2006 in terms of housing starts and the combined component of housing starts and slower development. I would also, I just think it's really important, like we talk about a failure of the private sector. And I had a Twitter thread that I put out on this where I highlighted this dynamic, right? The idea was that homes are really, really expensive. What we actually did was we made it, particularly in the aftermath of the global financial crisis, we made it really hard to get homes permitted and built. And as a result, the average size of a home rose much more rapidly than it did even in the 2005, 2006 time period, right? And so if you adjust on a per square foot basis, you don't really see a meaningful increase in home prices until the very teeth of the the home price increase associated with the pandemic, that outward shift in the utility value. And I could pull up the chart and show it, but like we're very much, we were going into this with homes representing relative value on a price per square foot, even if before we begin to talk about the dynamics of how much it costs us to finance them.
The price per square foot thing seems like something that we could discuss further, but let me drag it back up to kind of where I started, right? Because you're sort of taking issue. You're saying we've got a hyper Volckerized Fed under conditions that are actually much more challenging than Volcker faced at the time, and therefore the consequences of this misguided approach are much larger now, I think I'm fair in summarizing your perspective with that statement.
Well, when you say it's much more difficult, I mean, under Volcker, at least you could make the argument that inflation expectations were deeply entrenched, right? Again, I disagree with Volcker's approach. I think the evidence is actually very clear that the methodology meant that he made inflation worse rather than actually fixing inflation. If I look elsewhere around the world, the demographic impacts meant that the inflation on a global basis peaked in 1979 as compared to 1981 as it did in the United States.